Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Research Page, your source for DIY, gear reviews, and all things filmmaking. Now, as we can see, I'm still playing with the 70DD, that we played with last week. And I still have Omni lights behind me, but to mix it up, I switched over to the other side. Why did I do this? Just being funny, I guess, and you can rack on me in the comments and give me some love. But to get to the good stuff, as you know, we're your source for DIY, gear reviews, and all things filmmaking. We've put a lot of effort and a lot of focus into bringing the New Year Challenge off the ground. What I wanted to do this week is I've been working with my Blackmagic cinema camera rather exclusively as of late, other than the 70D. I know myself, I've reached out to other filmmakers, Lucas Pfaff, Chris Hunter, I've talked to Bruce Philpott, a wide array of other filmmakers about their post-processing in regards to the footage they get, applying to all cameras. Chris Hunter of Collective Thought Media out of Newport, Rhode Island, was nice enough to take a piece of footage that I myself shot out on Newport, Rhode Island, and color grade that footage. What you're going to see next is actually he'll be dictating and kind of going through his process. So let's just get into the thick of it. Go check out some BMCC footage, guys.
This is Chris Hunter with Collective Thought Media. I'm here doing a quick grade on some Blackmagic cinema camera files that were shot in ProRes by James DeMello out in Fairhaven, Massachusetts. What I did is I took these clips and I brought them into Adobe Premiere Pro CS 5.5, where I worked on them. Actually, I converted them to AVIs using the Sceneform codec using Media Encoder. I brought those AVIs into Premiere. They're a little bit easier to work on. And what I did is I used the Colorista plugin from Magic Bullet. And once I got all set up, I went into Colorista. I like to use the master control. That's my preferred editing mode because it has these RGB points where you can adjust RGB curves, which to me is intuitive. And like I feel like I'm kind of in Photoshop when I use this. It's mids, highlights, and shadows, and also contrast. And I like the easiness that it is to use those controls to color correct. So I'm just going through here and I'm kind of applying some different highlights. Basically, what you're doing is you're bringing contrast back into the scene, and you can do that globally by using the RGB contrast, or you can adjust each of the highlights, midtones, and shadows independently. So that's what I like about it, where you can color correct to the specific image that you're trying to create, and you can, darken the shadows in the mids, but keep the highlights where they are. Or you can bring the highlights down and lighten the mids a little bit. It gives you that control, which is nice. Another thing that I do is I like to make a mask. So here I'm setting a rectangular mask. I'm using the master power mask. I set the exposure to -16 during this so I can tell where my mask is affecting. I make the mask 100% width, increase the height. Move the mask down so that it only affects the bottom portion of this image, which is the foreground and the trees and the houses. Reduce the size of the feathering a little bit. I move it down again, so that way the sky isn't really affected here. I want to make a mask to only affect the foreground and not the sky. So now I turn my exposure back to 0. And now I can go back into Colorista. And now I'm just taking a look. I'm seeing how the sky isn't affected and how the bottom is. You can see the top of the sky there retains the original blue from the super flat log profile. And one thing I did here is I went into the master 3-way, and I brought everything a little bit towards the warm side, just a little bit, just to add a little bit of warmth to the image. A lot of the times when I shoot, I use a warming circular polarizer, which does the same thing. Now what I do here is I turn the saturation back down to 0, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another colorista layer shortly, effect layer, and I'm going to control the saturation through that instead. Now I can really go back in here and I start to tweak the levels on this foreground. Now that I have my RGB curves isolated to the foreground. So now I'm really going in and I'm trying to find an optimal contrast setting here. I want to keep the highlights in check. That's important. You can see this was shot in the middle of the day on purpose to test the camera. So I want to make sure I bring the highlights down a little bit in that case. Now what I'm doing here is I'm bringing the contrast way up. I did that because I felt like it needed it. And now I'm going to go back in and tweak shadows, midtones, and highlights independently after bringing the contrast up globally. And there I drop it down just a little bit back to 6.5 for RGB contrast. Now I duplicate that colorista layer, and I go back into the master, and I want to change my mask. I want to move the mask now to affect the sky only. Here you can see I'm making the mask shorter, and I'm moving its position up towards the sky. Keep moving it up. Make it a little bit taller. And I move it up again. Now I'm going to change the feather size to quite a bit bigger. Go from 16 to 45 to give it a nice gradation. Move it up a little bit more again, and set the exposure back to 0. Now I'll go back into my RGB curves, and I'll start to tweak the sky. I bring the highs down right away. I want to make the sky darker. I know that for sure. So I bring the highs down. I bring the mids down. I set the shadow to 0. We don't want to touch the shadows really up in the sky. RGB contrast to 0. And that's pretty good. I can tell I'm getting, definitely a more pronounced blue tone in the sky now. I think what I did there, I just knocked it down a little bit as far as the effect, down from -3 to -2 instead. So I feel pretty good there. And I'm just going to make one more adjustment to my feathering to increase it a little bit more. And I'm also going to move that colorista up a little bit, just to bring it off the trees. It was starting to turn the trees darker. So that's pretty good. Now I duplicate that effect again. And again, I'm going to go in and change my mask. I'm going to turn it off in this case. And this is going to be my saturation layer, where I globally change the saturation for this footage. So here we go into the master saturation, and I'm going to change that to 50. That looks pretty good. So there we can see with saturation on and off. We can see with the top and the bottom masks on and off. Turn my letterboxing back on. And here the final step I do is I apply some sharpening to each image. I ended up, you don't need to sharpen this footage too much. Overly sharp footage is evil, so don't sharpen your footage too much. That's very important. Now you can see the final color corrected image where we have the masked off sky as well as the masked off foreground, with each portion of the image color corrected independently. And I also added a little bit of movement here where I use the motion keyframes to have the image slightly scroll. This has been Chris Hunter with Collective Thought Media, working with the research page, bringing you some simple color correction for the Blackmagic Cinema camera.
Okay, well, I want to send a special thanks to my mentor, Chris Hunter. Thank you for taking the time to take that piece of footage and play with it and show us a little bit of the behind the scenes of Collective Thought Media. I hope that you guys have found this educational, as it was definitely a eye-opening experience for me. And if you want to see more types of projects like this, where you get, that editorial and as things are happening, please leave a comment in, the comments down below. And we'll look and start taking into consideration doing other projects like this as well. And with that being said, I'm JR. This is the TRP from the left side instead of the right. Saying thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next week.